I was at an event recently where I asked the audience, how many of you have used AI at work? And nearly everyone raised their hand. And I said, okay, how many of you have used AI other than ChatGPT at work? And nearly all the hands went down. When you take that same audience through an exercise to ask them about things like Waze and Google Maps or Amazon's recommendation engine or Spotify, it starts opening their mind to what AI actually is. It's like, oh yeah, we've been using some of these techniques for a long time. I think most of the places that can be reinvented with AI haven't been yet. If you look at the startup ecosystem, 95% of companies are clustering around the same 4 or 5 scenarios. How many companies are there trying to help you write better sales communication?
Hi, I'm Boaz, founder and CEO of Augmented AI Labs, and I'm excited that you're tuning in to the Shift AI podcast, a show that explores what it takes to thrive and adapt to the changing workplace in the age of remote work and AI. In today's episode, I'm thrilled to have Kieran Snyder as our guest. Kieran is a pioneering entrepreneur in AI and natural language processing who co-founded Textio, a company that has been transforming workplace communications since 2014. With a PhD in linguistics and a deep background in both engineering and writing, Kieran brings unique insights into bias detection, language optimization, and the responsible development of AI technologies. If you're interested in how AI is reshaping workplace communication, the challenges of bias in large language models, or the future of enterprise AI adoption, you are not going to want to miss this episode. We also want to send out a special thank you to Augmented AI Labs for sponsoring this episode. This is going to be a great show. We're super excited to have Kieran today and learn more about her perspectives on AI evolution. Let's get to it. All right, Kieran, thank you for being on the Shift AI podcast. I'm really excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I want to talk a little bit about your background, kind of how you got here. Can you tell the audience just a little bit about where you grew up, what your background was like, what kind of led to Textio and your involvement in the company?
Yeah. All right. Well, I grew up the daughter of an engineer and a writer, and I became an engineer and a writer, right? I grew up right outside of New York City. And it's actually really interesting. So my dad started his company. It's a small electrical engineering company, which, by the way, he's still running. He's turned to 85 this year. My dad is still running his company. They make radar systems for spacecraft. And he started that when I was 7. So I've seen his entrepreneurial journey forever. My mom actually didn't go to college until I was born. She went later. And then I watched her get a master's degree when I was in middle school and high school at NYU. And so the sort of value of entrepreneurship, ongoing learning was pretty much always there in my family. And, fast forward when I went to college, I studied linguistics and math. And it was the perfect combo of the analytical and ended up getting a PhD in natural language processing. I didn't know when I went to college a long time ago that this would be such a prescient combination. And then I ended up working in tech. I ended up getting a job at Microsoft, which was not my plan. I planned to get a job in academia, and then I didn't want the jobs I was getting. And I had a friend at the time who worked at Microsoft who said, hey, maybe you should come work here. We're hiring people like you. And I was like, nope, don't want to work in technology. I've been coding since I was a little kid, hate those people, not into it. He's like, okay, but you said you needed a job. I was like, true, I do. And long story short, I fell in love with software and making software. And so about a decade later, when Jensen Harris and I co-founded Textio, I was really to take all of these things I had ever done about looking at language and data about language and see if you could combine it with everything Jensen had ever done about really building billion-person user experiences and turn it into a product that you didn't need to be a data scientist to use, that could really help you understand the impact of your words before you wrote them for your audience. So it's a lot of words, but that's the story.
That's a great story. It's amazing how what you were doing early on was kind of perfectly led to Textio. And then, you guys never probably thought about what was happening in the last year and a half and how that is kind of impacting what you guys are doing with AI. But that's why I was so excited to talk with you today, because you were so early in this game thinking about this. And then now there's all sorts of interesting things around bias that I want to talk to you about today as it relates to AI. And so it's just been really looking forward to this conversation. So let's talk a little bit about when you two met and how, like, the origins of Textio, because was it 2013, 2014 timeframe? Is that when a lot of it was happening?
We started the company at the end of 2014. So fun fact, how we met. We're married, if you don't know that. So I started the company with my spouse. So we met professionally years ago. And really, again, like, his strength is always deep in user experience. My strength was always deep in data. And I think as we started thinking about Textio, we had both been involved in writing software for a very long time, him forever and me for close to forever. And we really sort of took a look. I mean, fun fact, obviously Textio became an HR tech company, helps people with recruiting and writing workplace feedback. But it didn't start out an HR tech company. It started out a word processing company. We thought what we were doing was competing with Google Docs and Word. You know, the vision we had was that there's been all these years of writing in software. You could make it look pretty. You could collaborate in the cloud. But at that time, nobody was helping you actually make the words perform. There was A/B testing, but that was and is still pretty rudimentary. You have to know what variables you should even test to make an A/B test work. So we're like, if you could take lots of data about what people have engaged with before for a very particular set of use cases, you could optimize. And our use cases were really around business writing. So unlike a general purpose word processor, which is like you use it to write your job description, but also your grocery list or your kid's letter to Santa or whatever, we were very specifically verticalized into business.
Yeah. So workplace
that was
communication was always on your mind from the beginning.
That was always the center. Yeah.
So now I notice that there's a lot more focus on HR, as you said, and that includes getting rid of bias in communication and all sorts of other things related to performance in the business. Can you talk just a little bit about where things have evolved for Textio?
Yeah. So when we first raised money for Textio, we raised our seed round, because this was 10 years ago. People weren't doing pre-seeds. We raised our seed round. We were 7 weeks old as a company. And we raised the seed round with a Kickstarter predictor, which we knew was never going to be the product. It was a good way to show the technology. Always right out of the gate, we knew we were going to be launching the first product in recruiting. And we knew that because, actually, we knew it was going to be HR. I don't know if we knew it was going to be recruiting. But I was publishing a lot at that time in mainstream media about bias at work and getting a lot of attention for it from the people who would go on to become our customers. So we really started out in HR very practically, like we knew we were going to win. We knew this was an underserved area of the enterprise. We cared about the problems they had, and we had a very unfair advantage to connecting with this customer base because they knew me. And so like any startup, you start, where you think you can make traction quickly. As we grew, you talked about feedback. Originally, the first product we wanted to build was the performance feedback product. But we didn't because at that time, the market wasn't really ready for it. Like, I don't think a lot of organizations wanted to know if they had bias in written feedback. Whereas recruiting, like the job descriptions were going to be published on the internet anyway. What you're trying to do is optimize for audiences to click. It felt like a safer place to start. So we started there. And then what happened is it just worked. Like we ended up selling to large enterprises so quickly. As a young startup, we had Apple and Cisco and Johnson & Johnson and NASA. And so then you build into your customer need. That was part of the need. And so we stuck around in HR.
So this is a two-part question, but we can go here for a little while because there's a lot here to unpack. But what's happened with large language models and Gen AI? I want to hear your take on that because, you were thinking about a lot of this stuff, especially around text, very, very early. And then the second part is there's been a lot of conversations about bias. Recent articles about computers choosing job candidates and there being a lot of bias in the large language models. And I'm sure you have some thoughts about that. So can we talk about both just this explosion of AI and your take on it?
So actually, I think we helped create the explosion. Right. So the first generative AI features in Textio were commercially launched in 2019. It was called Textio Flow. So before ChatGPT. And in fact, going back I think it was either late 2015, it was late 2015. I spoke at a machine intelligence conference at the University of Toronto, and Ilya from OpenAI also spoke at that conference, and Jeff Hinton was there. It was like a super small invite-only conference, but I presented the work that was going to become Textio, and he presented the work that was becoming OpenAI. And, there were 20 of us in the room, and I left and I went home and told my team, I was like, this is never going to work. What they're doing is never going to work, right? So this shows you didn't know everything. But the thing that they did so brilliantly, which, by the way, we're going to talk about your bias part because it's also the thing that creates the bias, is they built something that is truly horizontal. So we bet on Textio on verticalized solutions, meaning we build data sets that are very specific to the writing type that we're supporting. OpenAI has the internet as its training data, right? And most very large language model, foundation model companies are doing the same thing. Although more recently, you're seeing foundation model companies verticalize because of all these problems, right? But we thought what they were building would not work so well for our scenarios. And it doesn't. Like, it works to get you, lowest common denominator stuff. And we bet that business buyers would have a higher standard, and they mostly do. But free and powerful is pretty compelling, which is fundamentally what they offer. So we could talk about the bias side of it, but that was the sort of genesis. We saw it coming, but we built in a verticalized way.
Well, it's funny, in the last 2 or 3 months, I'm seeing a lot of people leave some of these big foundation companies and start smaller companies that are focused on verticalized foundation models. So you guys might have been, thinking about this way ahead. But yeah, let's talk more about bias, because when augmented AI has been building a bunch of solutions for companies, and a lot of those are around assessment and scoring. And there's just been a lot of controversy around large language models assessing resumes, assessing RFPs, and all sorts of things. So, can you talk about bias and help the audience understand kind of what's happening,
Sure.
Relative to that?
Beginning of 2023, I published a several-part research series where I tested out several large language models, especially OpenAI stuff, with Textio scenarios. So these are things like writing feedback, writing job descriptions. And I'm going to give a couple interesting data points because I think they illustrate the problem. One of the experiments that I ran was I asked ChatGPT to write sample performance feedback for, and then I made pairs of queries, a digital marketer who had a tough first year on the job who went to Harvard University, and then a digital marketer who had a tough first year on the job who went to Howard University. And Howard University is a very prominent, historically Black college and university, right? And I did hundreds of queries like this where the only difference was the alma mater, Harvard versus Howard. And it was fascinating. So any given example that the system produced of a performance feedback was, wasn't riveting, but it was fine. But when you look in aggregate, the development areas that the system imagines will be needed for people who go to Harvard are things like, you should step up to lead more. But the development areas it imagines for the Howard alums are things like, you don't have good attention to detail. You have missing technical skills. And so obviously, it's so interesting because any one document, you would be hard pressed to put your finger on the bias, because some employees do have missing technical skills. That's totally valid to comment on in a performance review. Some people should step up to lead more. That's totally valid to comment on in a performance review. But when you see the data in aggregate, the types of feedback that the system associates with people who went to this historically Black college and university are much more functional and fundamental in nature. And so it's a perfect example where if you didn't build a data set with this kind of bias in mind from the start, the samples that you're going to produce will just propagate, the data forward, the bias forward.
So what are some other ways of dealing with that? Now that we have the general knowledge trained on all these foundation models, is it about fine tuning? Is it about language models that are much more focused and verticalized? Like, how do we deal with some of this bias?
Yeah, I do think it's about language models that are more focused and verticalized. But I also think from the consumer standpoint, especially if you're a business consumer where the stakes of your communication are very high, right? Like the cost of bias in the workplace is very high and may accrue to you personally, depending on how things play out, right? you really have to make sure you're using solutions that are validating for you the level of bias that's in the solution. So at Textio, when we built the feedback product, we introduced a capability called Textio Verified, which tells you when you see it in the UI, we did the work. You can trust this from a bias standpoint. We have verified it for you. And we've told many customers looking at solutions in other spaces, like if a vendor isn't willing to put that stamp on it in the UI, you know that there's something underneath it. And you proceed at your own risk. But like, we took a strong point of view as a company, and of course our bread and butter is bias detection. So this was help, we took a strong point of view as a company that we were willing to go out on a limb and validate what was written from a bias standpoint. But I think that's what consumers need to, if it's not validated, there's probably something underneath it.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I've been reading recently some of the posts and writing that you've been doing about the AI rush, and I want to hear more about your thoughts. And also want to hear about kind of where your passion is now. I mean, I know you're still obviously as a founder heavily involved in Textio, but you're also starting to do some other things. And I've been really interested in some of your blog writing. And so can you talk about, you've been a little skeptical about the AI rush, and I want to hear more about your thoughts about companies that are out there, and especially given how early you guys were.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the writing I'm doing at Nerd Processor. So every week I'm sort of doing a new data story about AI or the workplace or workplace communication, sort of my playground. And I also recently took on a founder in residence role at Operator Collective. And so I'm working, I think this year in my coaching practice and in some of my advisories, I think I've probably talked to about 200 AI founders this year already. And there's a lot of really great ones, but there's a common cliff that these companies are falling off of, which is they are finding it easy-ish to raise early funding with really incredible promises. Incidentally, a lot of the promises do amount, especially in the B2B world, do amount to job replacement and efficiency. So we should talk about that. Like a lot of them are aiming to, do things your salespeople can do in half the time. So you need half as many salespeople or, replace some sort of more manual roles or work tasks. But the reality is a lot of these companies are struggling when it comes to raising, a couple of later rounds. You get through your seed round, okay, you get to the Series A where you're expected to have revenue traction and it's tricky. And so
what's happening there? Why is it?
Yeah, it's because they're not getting the sticky revenue metrics. They're making products, but people aren't necessarily purchasing. And if they are purchasing, they're not repurchasing. So the typical dynamic right now in big companies is like the CEO says, okay, everybody, like, let's get with AI. Leadership team, let's do it. We got to update. And especially in non-tech companies, you have all the execs who are like, okay, I got to bring AI in, but they don't know why or what they're looking for. They're not necessarily technically savvy. The company has convened an AI review board, mostly from out of the CISO's office, the information and privacy office. Those people are great, but they have no special training in AI. So they're trying to figure it out as they go. And so what happens is a vendor comes along and they're like, hey, I got a solution. And the buyer or potential buyer is like, cool. Is it AI? Okay, how do I tell the difference between this AI and this AI and this AI? And then if a vendor manages to Plinko chip their way through the purchase process and get to the end, invariably, it hasn't been aligned to a real problem that person had in the first place. And so the solutions aren't sticking. And so a year later, they churn out. And of course, if you're trying to continue to raise money, you need to not just be able to sell your product, but you need to show that people want to continue to use it on an ongoing basis.
And now, before we dive deeper, I want to take a quick moment and tell you a little bit about one of our podcast partners. As a listener of this show, I know you're trying to stay on top of all things AI and tech, which is why you have to check out the amazing GeekWire podcast, produced by GeekWire and hosted by Todd Bishop. It's a treasure of insights featuring industry leaders and the latest tech trends that are shaping our world. It's the perfect companion podcast to Shift AI. GeekWire podcast is where technology meets curiosity and covers the world of technology, startups, and geek culture. Expand your tech horizons and join the conversation. Tune into the GeekWire podcast today, a perfect complement to our own discussions here. Don't miss out. Follow the GeekWire podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite listening app. Before we go further with the interview, I want to tell you about one of our podcast sponsors, Augmented AI Labs, and how they're transforming businesses through intelligent AI solutions. Augmented AI Labs specializes in helping organizations unlock their potential with Gen AI, starting with your most valuable asset, your business knowledge. Their comprehensive process begins by identifying critical workflow challenges and knowledge needs, then building custom solutions that make your company's expertise instantly accessible. The Augmented AI Labs team combines fine-tuning and retrieval methods to ensure your AI solutions truly understand your business context. They thoroughly test and validate each solution, ensuring it delivers measurable value before creating a detailed technical blueprint for deployment. The real beauty of partnering with Augmented AI Labs is that they don't just stop at strategy. They build, deploy, and manage these solutions for you, continuously improving your knowledge systems while you focus on what you do best. If you're ready to transform how your organization leverages AI and knowledge, visit augmentedAIlabs.com and click on the Contact Us button. That's augmentedAIlabs.com. Now back to the episode. Yeah, we're seeing the exact same thing. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that after talking to 200 people, because I think that is the big issue. And in some cases, people are trying and not continuing to use, whether it's a chatbot or something else. And usually it's because it's not aligned to ROI and a big problem. But let's go and let's talk more about jobs and about, there's a ton of folks when I ask them on the show, what do you think about job loss? What do you think about the future for employees? A lot of the answers are, well, we are going to lose some jobs, but then we're going to gain some jobs because there's going to be this kind of creative, work that is getting done that we couldn't do before because we were mired in all these mundane tasks. So talk to me a little bit about how you think about this. And as you look into the future, what you think about all these jobs out there that may or may not get lost.
So I will answer your question about jobs, but I'm going to go even more upstream of your question for a second. So I have 3 teenagers that live in my house, and 2 of them are major tech enthusiasts. And one of them is a creative writer who felt very traumatized by the release of ChatGPT. Like it caused tears at the dinner table. Like we had to change the subject because she felt so much of her identity potentially being threatened, right? And these are kids who grew up with Textio, right? So this is not a new use case for them. By the way, same kid who is stressed about ChatGPT, happily using DALL-E to create sample illustrations for her novel, which is mind-bending, right? But it got me really interested in what kids think and expect, especially because schools have put so many guidelines. Schools are trying to figure out what to do. And so I did a survey in the greater Seattle area of a couple hundred middle school and high school students. And the thing that was, of all the data, the thing that was most striking to me is how much further along the adoption curve middle school students were than high school students. So high school students, much, much more likely to agree that their school's policies made sense, much less likely to say in an anonymous survey that they have used AI on homework without their teacher knowing. Middle school students confidently assert, these rules are stupid. I disagree. Yes, I'm going to use AI everywhere it makes sense to, but very few of them, comparatively, 75%, were not using it to plagiarize per se. They were using much more creative use cases, like help me come up with an outline or double check my math homework or things that actually are pretty virtuous learning tools. And so going back to your job thing, one of the virtues of me not running a company right now is I can just be more clear-eyed. I think there is going to be job loss in the short term. I do. I think we're seeing it already play out in a lot of knowledge worker roles. But I imagine pretty quickly those teenagers who in 10 years are in the workforce and in 20 years are running teams and in 30 years they're running companies, they will create new ways of working. I think there's going to be a bit of a lag. But I already see the difference even between our oldest high school student and our middle school student. And
Yeah,
I see it in their peer group.
that's so interesting. I think you're right. I think a CEO 30 years from now is just going to be doing things a lot differently. They're going to probably be going faster. They're going to have certain kind of superpowers that CEOs don't have now. It's just going to be a different way of running a company.
Exactly. I think there's also, we're talking about AI here, but I think it's really interesting that this AI movement is taking off right as I think we're seeing labor movements take off, right? I think, around the country and certainly in tech, we're seeing more organizing on behalf of employees than you would have seen 10 or 15 years ago. And so at some point, the future is made from the intersection or collision of these two movements. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think those are the two things that are going to change the workplace most significantly.
Yeah, we just saw this, and they used robots as the word that they were using in automation, but clearly AI was part of their pushback. And we see it on the West Coast with the Boeing strike, and we saw it on the East Coast.
Yes.
And so I think you're right. I think figuring out, because labor is very powerful, how they're going to land on some of these issues. We already see, and this is a question for you, just kind of politically around regulation and non-regulation, but also around the appetite for uncovering bias in the workplace. I mean, it seems like in the next decade, there may be some changes in the way that we think about bias and the way that shows up in policy. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, in middle of last year, I had the chance to go to the Congressional Caucus for AI and brief them on AI and bias as part of a delegation of several technologists and startup leaders and researchers who were covering different aspects of this. And among all things, first of all, at a time when the country is pretty divided, I will say that event made me more optimistic and less cynical than I have felt about politics in a long time, mainly because AI as a topic isn't all the way politicized yet. And so people don't inherit a point of view from their political party. And so what I experienced in that setting was a bunch of pretty smart people. They're both Congress people and some of their staffers actually trying to figure out what they thought, which was so cool because we rarely get the opportunity to see that in action, right? But the topic they wanted to talk about the most across my talk and all the delegations were IP rights and tracking, how do you, with stuff like the New York Times lawsuit with OpenAI, I think we're going to continue to see, a bunch of novelists have mobilized to try to get their source texts removed from training models, right? You're gonna continue to see this. Obviously, the Disney and the Actors Guild strike, and it's coming up all over. Again, labor intersecting here around IP rights. Yeah, bias does come up as a concern in these conversations, but far more focus that I saw was on the topics of rights and attribution and IP. And I don't know if that's because of who's in their ear or because it feels like an accessible topic for them to understand.
Yeah.
Legally speaking.
Yeah. That's really, really, really interesting. Well, shifting gears a little bit, but also going back to that discussion about young people, I've been thinking a lot about the way that this is showing up for people that are early in the workforce. And a combination of AI and remote work, I think those two things married together has built this out. But a lot of people young people are not feeling mentored in the way that they were when they were showing up at the office.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm interested to hear from you, who were some mentors that impacted you along the way? And then now, how you think about mentorship when you are talking to young entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I will say, I will answer your mentorship question. I'll add one interesting data point about young people with AI in the workforce. The thing I mentioned before, that dynamic in enterprises where the CEO tells the execs, let's get some AI. One thing that's different, so in the past, when a company is making a choice about a software vendor, that choice is usually made somewhere near the middle or top of an organization, right? People who have enough scope to see the problem being solved. That is getting fully inverted right now. So frequently what's happening is the youngest workers in an organization, people who are earliest career, are discovering tools and bringing them into work. And maybe it's the kind of thing where it was freemium. They tried something free. They brought it in, the whole team got to try it. And so these execs who have built their careers mostly in the pre-AI era are looking to younger workers for technology guidance in a way that would not have happened 10 or 15 years ago, not so explicitly yet. And so I think younger workers may find a different kind of empowerment. But, to your point about mentorship, that's real. And I do think we miss something when people aren't co-located. When I start another company, I will probably start it co-located. Like, I think there is value in people hearing each other, at least, to a strong amount of time. And for some roles, it's especially valuable. If you're working in a sales role, it's really hard to learn how you talk to customers if you don't hear people doing it all day long. Just, some things speed up your learning. Mentors for me early on and throughout actually the whole Textio journey, Steven Sinofsky is a really big one. Steven was a super senior exec at Microsoft for many years. I worked for him. And then he had become a board partner at Andreessen Horowitz around the time we started Textio, and has been and continues to be like a key mentor for both Jensen and me. I don't know anyone better at thinking about enterprise software top to bottom. So he's been really, really valuable. I've often looked up to sort of along the way, there's a woman named Cynthia T, who is currently SVP of engineering at Smartsheet. She was my mentor when I first came back from maternity leave after I had my daughter, because she was a model of how you build a strong technology leadership career with kids. Still a good friend. So, you pick different mentors along the way for what you need to learn at the time.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I will say, going back to your comment about young people in the workplace, I'm seeing that too. I see young people raising their hand to be part of the AI task force, and they're excited about this, and they're the ones that are uncovering things and people are listening to them. So I definitely think that's true. Very interesting. Well, I always like to, as we get close to the end of the show, just talk about the future a little bit. And, what are some of the things that you're seeing around the corner, maybe some things that people are missing. But if you were to try to describe the future of work, the future of AI in 2 words, and then you can elaborate, what would those 2 words be? And then how are you seeing things unfold?
I mean, I guess I'd just stay like actively emerging. I think the 2 words are actively emerging. I was at an event recently where I asked the audience, how many of you have used AI at work? And, nearly everyone raised their hand. And I said, okay, how many of you have used AI other than ChatGPT at work? And nearly all the hands went down. And P.S., that probably means they don't know when they're using AI, because many of the tools that they're using at work are using AI. When you take that same audience through an exercise to ask them about things like Waze and Google Maps or Amazon's recommendation engine or Spotify, it starts opening their mind to what AI actually is. Like, oh yeah, we've been using some of these techniques for a long time. But I think the reason I say actively emerging is that most of the places that can be reinvented with AI haven't been yet. Like, if you look at the startup ecosystem, 95% of companies are clustering around the same 4 or 5 scenarios. How many companies are there trying to help you write better sales communication, right? I did a data story recently where I looked at, I can't remember how many emails, but it was 4 years of cold email that I had received as Textio's CEO in my inbox. And both the number shoots up dramatically after ChatGPT is launched, and the number that are explicitly saying they're selling AI to help me sell shoots up dramatically.
Yeah.
And of course, all the mails are pretty terrible, right? They're all
right.
They're all just sort of thin wrappers on GPT APIs. So they're pretty terrible. But I think the majority of places that can be upended, people haven't imagined yet. And so I think the next 5 years, as you start graduating from college, some of these younger potential entrepreneurs who are growing up a little more AI native, it's going to change things. I was the first generation that got to use the internet at college. I got my first email account when I was a freshman, and it was only because I was taking computer science. Everybody else got it when they were sophomores or juniors, right? And you watch, 10 years later, that created the .com boom. And I think we're going to see something pretty similar with today's graduates. It's just that most of today's workers haven't imagined the places that are going to get disrupted yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exciting. Well, tell the audience a little bit about how to reach out to you and also about the things that you're doing now around just writing that you're passionate about. How should people engage?
Yeah, the best way is to either follow me on LinkedIn, where I publish lots of my stuff, or go subscribe to the weekly newsletter. You can get that at nerdprocessor.com and hit subscribe. Every single week, I write a story that is free, and it's really about, data stories about workplace and AI. So I usually look at a new data set, break it down, tell you what's inside it, and you can kind of use that stuff at work. So those are probably the easiest way. I literally do read all the mail that people send in response to that newsletter. So if you ever have questions about it and you want to reply, I will see it and I will answer you. So those are probably the two best ways.
Well, that's great. Well, Kieran, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was really, really interesting to talk with you, especially as a Seattle native company that you started, and also just your perspective on AI as this story is still unfolding. So thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. Lots of fun.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Such a pleasure to have Kieran Snyder as our guest on today's episode. Her insights into AI development, from her early days at Microsoft to pioneering bias detection at Textio, offers valuable perspective on where we're headed. Her research into how different generations approach AI, especially in education and the workplace, gives us a glimpse of how the technology might reshape our future. If you want to stay connected with Kieran and follow her insights on AI and workplace communication, you can subscribe to her newsletter at nerdprocessor.com or find her on LinkedIn, where she regularly publishes data stories about workplace trends and AI development. I continue to be amazed by the guests we've had on the show, and I'm excited about the ones joining us in the near future. I truly appreciate you spending your time with us. Thank you for listening to this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to the Shift AI podcast for the exciting interviews and to the Augmented Edge newsletter for updates on how AI can scale your business. The Shift AI podcast is syndicated by GeekWire, and we're grateful to have the show sponsored by Augmented AI Labs. Our theme music was created by Dave Angel.